everybody, and welcome to a very special interview. I have with me Tony Perry and Alexis Bunten, and they're going to be talking to us about their new picture book that just came out over the summer. It's Keepunumuk, and it's telling the story, the real story of Thanksgiving. And why don't I go ahead and let them introduce themselves, and maybe you can tell us about the book. And first of all, am I pronouncing the name correctly?
Hi, I'm Alexis Bunten. I am the co-author of Keepunumuk, Weeâchumun's First Thanksgiving, and that's how you pronounce it. Those are words in the Wampanoag language, which we want all children to understand as they're coming to be introduced to the holiday of Thanksgiving. And I am Unangan and Yupik from Bristol Bay, Alaska, South Naknek, and I currently live in California, but I happen to be joining you from Juneau, Alaska today, which is why my background looks like this.
Thank you.
And I'm Tony Perry. I am also one of the co-authors of Keepunumuk, Weeâchumun's Thanksgiving story. I am a citizen of the Chickasaw Nation, and I live in England.
Well, thank you both for joining us. Well, we can just jump in and talk about the book. Why is this book so important now, and why can you tell us a little bit about how it came about?
Yeah, I can take this one and Tony can help me on it. In 2016, I was at a dinner and I made a friend at this random dinner, and it was in October. And we were talking about how harmful Thanksgiving is for Native peoples, in the sense that when we grow up, and we're in the public schools and exposed to public media or just the general media scape, that's really the first time that we see ourselves with all these stereotypes. And it's also extremely harmful for non-Native people because they shouldn't grow up with stereotypes and othering of Native Americans as well. And so we cooked up this idea to start a decolonizing Thanksgiving dinner. And that kind of turned into a series of blogs and educational materials about what Thanksgiving really means and what we can celebrate and how we can make it more inclusive. And then, Tony, why don't you tell your part, how you came in?
Well, actually, right about when Alexis was doing this, in November 2018, I had just published my first children's book, which is a historical fiction book called Chula the Fox, about a child from the Chickasaw Nation coming to terms with life growing up, basically. And I had just published that book a month before, and I had seen a Facebook Live interview that Alexis had done about decolonizing Thanksgiving and trying to unpick the myths. I had done a bit of studying around Native American history overall, and certainly around my own tribe. So I thought I was somewhat knowledgeable, but I realized how little I actually knew about the Thanksgiving story. And what came to mind for me there was I have two young children. They're currently now 9 and 7, so they were younger then. And having read to them, the same story often multiple times, I realized, why not create a new story rather than instead of having to unpick all of these things? Why don't we create a new narrative that can become that new default narrative, so that this can become the Thanksgiving story, and then the one that so many of us take for granted can be one that we're trying to learn from. And so Alexis and I started to work together on trying to, thinking about what might we need to do to create such a book. I'm going to pass this over to Alexis now in terms of looking at kind of that journey about making sure that we've got, free and informed prior consent, and being able to work with the Wampanoag Nation and see whether this is a story that we could tell.
Right.
Yeah, well, we wanted to write this story about Thanksgiving from an Indigenous perspective, but we come from nations that aren't the Wampanoag tribe, which was the tribe that hosted the Pilgrims after that first winter and helped them to grow the food so they could survive and make it. And we started, we knew that we needed to get free prayer and informed consent. So we started to go around and reach out to the tribes for that consent to write this book. And then we just realized that even if we're Native American, we're very diverse Native Americans, and we can't write a book from a perspective of another tribe at all. And then I had a light bulb moment and realized that my friend Danielle, our lead author, Danielle Greendeer, who I had, we had done consulting work together. I reached out to her and I said, well, we're writing this book, we're looking for consent, we need support. And she also has 3 young children of her own, and I had a young child. We all had preschool age children at the time. So we very much were motivated to write this book for them so they could grow up differently than us. And she said, yeah, I'll help you with that. And by the way, I've been wanting to write children's books. And we asked her if she'd be interested in being the lead author. And she said yes. So we've been working together as a team ever since.
That's wonderful. And I want to talk a little bit more about Tony, how you were talking about creating a new narrative for Thanksgiving. So what makes this story so different than what so many of us grew up with? And also how are you hoping that this will kind of change the narrative around Thanksgiving and around Native Americans more generally?
Yeah. I think I'll answer both of those in part. So in terms of what makes this different, the first part of it is that it's been designed, I think, with a Native perspective at its heart, from us as authors, and from Garry Meeches Sr., who is Anishinaabe, as the illustrator. So all of us come from varied backgrounds, and we basically came together thinking, okay, rather than just retelling the story, but us as Native Americans, what is the best way to do this? And we went back and forth on that, thinking about what's the best way to structure this, what's the best way to tell this, and also thinking above all, when we tell this story, how do we do it in a way where the Wampanoag people will be happy with what we are doing? How do we actually do something markedly different from what's done before? How do we, in essence, right the wrongs? And so that took a lot of thought and reflection. And Danielle does a lot of work around food sovereignty, and also preserving the food of her ancestors. And as we were doing this, one day Danielle sat before corn and just started to think. And this idea of another story idea, a completely different storyline, came to mind for her. And it's like, wait a minute, what if we do this? And so Keepunumuk tells the story from the perspective of what we as Native Americans call the 3 sisters, which are corn, beans, and squash.
From a storytelling point of view, one of the key issues and problems that we recognize in terms of the way Thanksgiving has been told in the US is that it's kind of an us-them narrative, and it's from the dominant society's point of view. And we wanted to erase this whole pilgrims narratives, pilgrims versus natives, natives helping pilgrims. We didn't want to have that us-them narrative. So when Danielle came up with this idea of why don't we tell the story from the perspective of Weeâchumun, corn, and the 3 sisters in nature, that essentially put humans together in the same paradigm. And it's naturally bringing us together to be inclusive, to think about this story. So that was a specific rhetorical decision that we made to undo the othering that the traditional Thanksgiving story does.
Okay. And can we talk a little about, I know you were mentioning before we got started, Alexis, about how a lot of teachers and librarians, they want to do the right thing about the Thanksgiving story, and they know how problematic the story that is usually told. They know how problematic that is, but they're not sure what else to do, and so a lot of times they just avoid it altogether. And this book is really offering an alternative, a better way that they can do that. Can you talk a little bit more about that, and also the resources and even the curriculum that you've come up with? Because it's a really amazing resource that I think a lot of teachers and librarians are looking for.
Thank you. Yes. And we definitely want to penetrate every library and every classroom with our story, because we want to support teachers, librarians, and parents to celebrate this holiday. We're not saying get rid of Thanksgiving. And we understand that a lot of people who want to promote inclusivity and peace and for everybody who lives in the US, they don't want to be telling that stereotypical story that we all grew up with. That for your audience, it's meant to uphold white supremacy, basically. And they don't want to do that. So it's been avoided. Excuse me. Oh my gosh. Had a cold last week. So that's why we use the rhetorical devices that we use to tell the story from the point of view of corn, and the idea of really centering nature and humans' place in nature. And so we also created curriculum resources that I'm sure you'll share that you can be used in the home, in the classroom, and they're meant to support children with every different learning style and support social, emotional, and cognitive learning. And there's a lot of crafts and art involved that scaffold along with other metrics. I'm totally losing the word for it. Curriculum standards. With curriculum standards for English language, and also the sciences, and also the arts. So we're really blending all those together in those curricula. And I have now piloted it with a few children, and they really enjoy it.
That's wonderful. Such a wonderful resource. And I love about how the book, it's about the book itself, but it's also about the whole thought process that you put into it, and really shifting the paradigm. Kind of like you were saying, Tony, you didn't want to just be retelling the same story, but you wanted to really do it in a completely new way. And
And just to follow up on that point, actually, I think the other part that we thought about was what's the best way to tell this story. And we were very deliberate in choosing a picture book for this, because a picture book is the first exposure for many young children into story. So that was number one. It's going to be more likely to be their first exposure to Thanksgiving that they may remember. The second part of it is that typically picture books are read more than once. I know there are certainly stories that I go back to, or when my children were younger, that we would go back to night after night. And they really enjoyed that. And so that the story really becomes a part of them. And so we wanted to start with the youngest of readers. And then that builds into schools, where schools start looking at different ways of representing Thanksgiving, more inclusive ways, as they get into that time of year. And then using that to be able to start larger conversations around what's wrong with the current way that we see Thanksgiving, what's some of the history that comes with it, and what are ways that we could rethink it. So this is really meant as a way of trying to start a bigger conversation whilst creating a new narrative for children growing up today and going on.
I was wondering, could you talk about that just to close? Could you talk a little bit more about kind of in general, obviously the book would be part of this, but if people are trying to, as you say, decolonize Thanksgiving, be more conscious about how they celebrate the holiday. As you say, you're not asking people to get rid of it, but just to be more conscious. In general, how can families do that in classrooms, that as well?
Alexis has done a lot of thought and
Right.
work around this, so I'm going to pass that one to her for now, and I'll follow up.
Well, a very simple thing you can do is to look at where you live and to understand the foods that you're eating at Thanksgiving, because the Thanksgiving traditional meal in the US is largely made up of foods that are indigenous to North America, that have spread around the world, and they have histories and stories behind them, and they've been cultivated and had a relationship with human beings that have stewarded them for thousands of years.
Millennia.
And so, yeah, exactly. That's why I said thousand or thousands. I need to dig deeper into my bioarchaeology on that. But you can find resources to learn the history behind corns, beans, and squash. You can learn about the three sisters, and then maybe that would be a stepping point into learning about the indigenous plants where you live and what's edible, what's medicinal. It connects you to place, really. And if you're not native and you are a descendant of settlers to this country, this is your country too, and you belong here. But a part of a way of connecting to it is really understanding the plants and animals that are indigenous to this space, as our native communities have known all along. And we're even trying to pass on to our kids after the intergenerational trauma effects of colonization. So that's one step. And maybe I got a little too deep there, but just picking up our book and reading it and checking out the curriculum and sharing it with your families. And the first Colonized Thanksgiving event I had on Thanksgiving back in 2016, we brought together people of all different ages, all different backgrounds, all different political spectrums, and we just talked about it. We talked about Thanksgiving and where our ancestors came from and what we were eating. And it was one of the most beautiful gatherings I've ever been to.
I think just to add on to that is kind of a wider point about thinking more carefully about our role within the world and recognize that we are connected to each other. We're connected to the plants and the animals and the climate more generally. And so it's just about being more aware of it, being more aware of where we fit within a bigger puzzle, and thinking about what we can do, I guess, in essence, to look out for each other and the world around us. But in the very least, having that awareness. I think that's another part that really draws out with the story. So yeah, it's just really about thinking about the world around us too.
I love that, Tony.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. What a beautiful lesson for kids and for grown-ups to learn about. Thank you both so much for joining us. I feel like I'm cutting this really short, but I feel like we could talk about this for a long time, but I'm going to be respectful of your time. And thank you so much. If anybody has not checked out the book yet, I highly recommend it. It's something I think should just be part of every classroom and home. And we really appreciate all the work that you've done. Thank you so much.
Thank you.